someone asked you to describe the person who has hurt you most in your life, and you found yourself defending them, explaining why they weren't really that bad, why you understood why they did it, why you maybe even felt protective of them, this video is not going to judge you for that, not even slightly. What you'd be describing is one of the most misunderstood, most dismissed, and most important psychological responses that exists. It has a name, it has a clear neurological basis, and it has absolutely nothing to do with being weak, being stupid, or being in love with someone who doesn't deserve it. It is your brain doing exactly what it was designed to do in the conditions it found itself in. It's called Stockholm Syndrome. And while most people know the name, almost nobody knows what it actually is, where it comes from, how it works in the brain, or why it shows up in so many more situations than hostage crises. Because it does. It shows up in relationships, in families, in workplaces, in cults, anywhere that specific conditions of power and dependence exist together long enough. In this video, we're going to go through the real story behind the name, what actually happens in the brain, the 4 specific conditions that create this response, where it shows up in ordinary life, and, most importantly, what it means for the people who have experienced it, and for the people who love them and don't understand why they won't simply leave. One thing I want to say before we go any further. This is not a video about what's wrong with the people who experience this. It's a video about what's right with them, about how intelligently and efficiently the human mind solves the problem of surviving impossible situations. The survival mechanism is the thing we're looking at, not a failure. Let's go back to where the name came from. August 23rd, 1973, Stockholm, Sweden. A man named Jan-Erik Olsson walked into the Kreditbanken, a central Stockholm bank, with a submachine gun, took 4 employees hostage, and demanded the release of a prison friend named Clark Olofsson. The Swedish government eventually agreed. Both men held the hostages in the bank vault for 6 days. What happened inside that vault over those 6 days was what made this case famous, and what gave this phenomenon its name. The 4 hostages, all adults, none of whom had any prior connection to the captors, began to develop feelings of attachment toward the 2 men holding them at gunpoint. They worried about their captors' welfare. They feared police intervention more than captivity. After the siege ended, they refused to testify against the men who had held them hostage. One of the female hostages became engaged to one of the captors. The world was baffled. Psychiatrist Niels Bejerot, who advised Swedish police during the crisis, coined the term Stockholm Syndrome to describe what he observed. But here's something important that gets left out of most popular accounts of this story. The term was coined to explain something the police and public found convenient to call a pathology, to call it a syndrome, a disorder, rather than what it actually was. In 2008, one of the original hostages, Kristen Enmark, gave an interview in which she pushed back strongly against this framing. She said she had never felt that she suffered from a syndrome. She described the police as having behaved recklessly and the captors as having treated her with more care than the authorities did. She believed her feelings made complete rational sense given her experience, and importantly, she was not wrong to say that. The research that followed has largely borne her out. What Stockholm Syndrome actually describes is not a malfunction. It's a remarkably rational adaptive response to an impossible situation. When you are completely dependent on someone for your survival, and that person shows you any degree of kindness or humanity, your brain does something very specific. It doesn't break down, it gets to work. It starts building the best possible relationship it can, with the only source of safety available to it. That's not weakness. That's intelligence under extreme constraint. Let's get specific about what actually happens in the brain, because this is where the weakness narrative completely falls apart. Stockholm Syndrome involves at least 3 distinct neurological systems interacting simultaneously, and understanding them makes the response feel not just understandable but almost inevitable in the right conditions. The first is the amygdala, the brain's threat detection and fear response center. In a captivity situation, the amygdala is on constant high alert. Sustained fear of this intensity is physiologically exhausting and cognitively disabling. The brain's survival systems actively look for ways to reduce it. And here is the critical point. Any small reduction in threat, any moment of kindness, Any gesture of humanity from the captor is registered by the amygdala as a massive positive signal, not because it represents real safety, but because it represents the absence of immediate danger. Think about what this means practically. In normal circumstances, someone giving you a glass of water would barely register. But if you've been sitting in terror for 12 hours, genuinely uncertain whether you'll survive, and the person holding you captive brings you water and asks if you're cold, that action registers in your nervous system as something close to profound relief. The contrast between the baseline of fear and the moment of small kindness creates a disproportionate emotional response. Your brain isn't being fooled, it's doing the exact math of your situation. The second system is the dopamine reward pathway. The same intermittent reinforcement mechanism that drives addiction and trauma bonding operates here. When kindness is unpredictable, when it arrives after periods of threat or indifference, the dopamine response it produces is larger than if the same kindness appeared consistently in a safe context. The unpredictability is what makes it neurologically powerful. The brain becomes oriented toward the moments of warmth in a way it simply would not be if kindness were constant and guaranteed. The third system is oxytocin, sometimes called the bonding hormone. Oxytocin is released in response to close physical proximity, perceived care, and shared experience. It does not distinguish between chosen and unchosen proximity. It does not check whether the relationship is healthy or coercive. It simply responds to the conditions in front of it. And in a captivity situation, those conditions often include extended close contact, moments of perceived protection, and the intense shared experience of a high-stress situation. The brain begins to bond whether it wants to or not. Put these three systems together: a fear response seeking any reduction in threat, a reward system amplified by unpredictable kindness, and a bonding system triggered by proximity and shared experience, and you don't get weakness, you get something almost mechanically inevitable. Given the right conditions, this response is not a question of character, it's a question of neuroscience. And there's one more mechanism worth naming. In situations of extreme powerlessness, the brain also begins to engage in something called identification with the aggressor, a concept first described by Anna Freud. When you have no power to escape a threat, one survival strategy your brain tries is to psychologically align yourself with the source of the threat, not because you've lost your judgment, because reducing the psychological distance between you and the person who controls your survival reduces the terror of being at their mercy. It's armor made out of connection. Armor made out of connection. That's the most honest description I can give you of what this is. Research on Stockholm Syndrome, and the broader psychological literature on coercive control, has identified 4 specific conditions that, when present together, consistently produce this response. They don't all need to be at maximum intensity, but they all need to be present. Understanding them is important because they explain why this happens in so many more situations than a bank vault. Condition 1, perceived inability to escape. This is the foundation. The person must feel, genuinely, not theoretically, that they cannot leave. This doesn't require literal physical confinement. Economic dependence, social isolation, children, immigration status, housing, terror of retaliation, or the gradual erosion of self-confidence can all create the psychological equivalent of locked doors. The brain doesn't respond to objective escape routes, it responds to what feels possible from inside the situation. Condition 2, isolation from outside perspectives. The person must be cut off, or significantly limited in their access, to outside viewpoints, outside relationships, outside information. This isolation is frequently engineered deliberately in coercive relationships. It makes the captor or abuser the primary source of both reality and safety, 2 things that should never be concentrated in the same person. When the person hurting you is also the primary person explaining to you what's happening and why, the psychological environment is complete. Condition 3, perceived small kindnesses from the captor or abuser. The key word is perceived. The kindnesses don't need to be large, genuine, or consistent. They need to be present, and they need to be interpreted in the context of the threat, as evidence that the captor has some humanity, a moment of gentleness after violence, a statement of care amid control, a gesture of protection toward the victim from an outside threat, These small signals are disproportionately significant precisely because of their scarcity and the context in which they appear. Condition 4. The captor or abuser is perceived as a threat to survival. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive condition. The attachment doesn't form despite the threat. It forms partly because of it. When your survival is genuinely in someone else's hands, your brain's bonding systems activate in a specific way that they wouldn't in a low-stakes relationship. The stakes of the relationship, the fact that this person literally determines whether you are safe, is part of what gives the bond its intensity. When all four of these conditions are present, perceived inability to escape, isolation from outside perspectives, small perceived kindnesses, and a survival level threat, the response is not surprising. It's almost predictable. The brain builds the strongest possible bond with the only source of both danger and relief it has access to. Because in evolutionary terms, that's exactly the right move. The survival mechanism is working correctly, and this is why Stockholm Syndrome is not a hostage-specific phenomenon. You don't need to be in a bank vault, you need the four conditions. And those four conditions appear, sometimes in reduced intensity, sometimes in full force, in a number of very ordinary environments. Abusive, intimate relationships. This is the most common context in which these dynamics appear. Economic control, isolation from family and friends, cycles of violence followed by remorse and affection, the gradual erosion of a partner's independent sense of reality. All four conditions are frequently present in high-control intimate partnerships. The bond that forms is not confusion. It is the brain's rational response to an environment where the person who controls your safety is also the person closest to you. Abusive or controlling family systems. A child cannot escape a parent. They are completely economically and emotionally dependent on the adults in their home. When a parent is also a source of fear, the child's brain does exactly what the Stockholm Syndrome research predicts. It builds the strongest possible bond with that parent, defends them, finds explanations for their behaviour, and often protects them from outside judgment. This isn't failure to perceive the harm. This is the survival system operating perfectly in the only environment available. High control groups and cults. The four conditions appear in remarkably clean form in cult environments. Members are isolated from outside perspectives and relationships. They are told their survival, spiritual, social, sometimes literal, depends on the group and its leader. The leader alternates between punishment and approval, kindness and condemnation. Leaving feels not just difficult but existentially dangerous. The bonds that form between members and leaders in these environments are among the most intense documented examples of Stockholm Syndrome dynamics outside of literal captivity. Institutional environments, prisons, certain military contexts, and total institutions where individual autonomy is removed and survival depends on those in authority can produce Stockholm-type dynamics in reduced but recognizable forms. The research on prisoner-guard relationships, on soldiers and commanding officers in abusive hierarchies, and on patients in certain institutional care settings all show elements of the same pattern. Attachment forming toward the source of both control and intermittent kindness, coercive workplace environments, economic dependence on a controlling or abusive employer, isolation from professional networks outside the organization, alternating episodes of public humiliation and private praise. These conditions exist in certain toxic workplaces, and the loyalty and protectiveness that employees sometimes show toward these employers confuses outsiders who don't understand the neurological mechanics of what's happening. The person defending their abusive boss isn't naive, they're surviving. The context changes, the vault changes, the four conditions remain constant, and so does the response. One of the most painful aspects of Stockholm Syndrome, and one that causes enormous additional harm, is the response it generates in people outside the situation. Family members, friends, therapists who haven't been trained in trauma. They look at someone defending their abuser, staying with their captor, protecting the person who is hurting them, and they ask the question that feels obvious from outside. Why don't they just leave? This question, however genuinely meant, causes real harm, because it frames the person's behavior as a choice they're making badly, rather than a neurological response to conditions they didn't choose. It implies that the person defending their abuser is somehow failing to see what's obvious, which from the outside it may be. But from the inside, what's obvious to the outsider doesn't exist. The four conditions have created an environment in which the outside perspective isn't just absent. It's been systematically removed. The outsider is using their own reality as the reference point. In their reality, leaving is possible. In their reality, the abuser's behaviour is clear and unambiguous. In their reality, the relationship doesn't make sense. But the person inside the situation is not living in the outsider's reality. They are living in an environment where leaving feels unsurvivable, where the abuser's behaviour has been explained and contextualized in ways that feel coherent from inside, and where the bond they feel is neurologically real, regardless of how the situation looks from outside. What actually helps is not argument, not logic, not incredulity at how the person could possibly feel what they feel. What helps is the opposite: patient, consistent, non-judgmental presence that provides an alternative source of safety. Not a debate about whether the person should leave, but a relationship that begins to offer something the captor or abuser has been the sole provider of: genuine, unconditional care. When that alternative source of safety exists and remains stable over time, the conditions change. And when the conditions change, the response can change with them. If you love someone in this situation, don't argue with the bond. Offer an alternative to it. Stay close. Stay patient. Don't deliver ultimatums about the person they're defending. Just be the safest, most consistent presence you can be, for as long as it takes. That is, genuinely, the most useful thing you can do. Steady presence is more powerful than any argument. How does Stockholm Syndrome end? Not all at once. Not with a single moment of clarity. Research on recovery from coercive control situations shows a much more gradual process, one that mirrors, in reverse, how the conditions that created the bond were established in the first place. Physical distance from the captor or abuser is the single most important first condition of recovery, not because it immediately changes how the person feels, but because it removes the ongoing neurological inputs that are sustaining the bond. The amygdala's fear response begins to de-escalate. The intermittent reward of small kindnesses is no longer present to reinforce the attachment. The oxytocin of close proximity fades. These are not quick processes, but they are reliable ones, given time and safety. The restoration of outside perspectives, through reconnecting with friends, family, or a therapist who understands trauma, allows the reality distortion created by isolation to gradually correct. This is a delicate process, because a person in early recovery from coercive control often still experiences significant loyalty to the person they've been bonded with. Confrontational approaches, how could you have defended them, can push the person back toward the relationship. Patient, non-judgmental presence that simply offers an alternative reality over time is what the research consistently supports. As the conditions change, as escape becomes genuinely possible, as isolation decreases, as outside safety becomes real, the brain's assessment of the situation begins to update. The bond doesn't disappear. Former hostages and survivors of abusive relationships often describe a sustained period of grief for the person they bonded with, for the version of that relationship they believed in, for the time they spent in it. That grief is real and should be treated as real. It's not evidence that the relationship was secretly good. It's evidence that the bond was neurologically genuine, even if the relationship that produced it was harmful. Recovery is not the deletion of everything that happened. It's the gradual development of enough safety, enough distance, and enough alternative perspective to be able to see the situation for what it was, without shame, without self-blame, and without having to deny that the feelings were real. They were. They just formed in conditions that were not of your making. The conditions created the response. Changing the conditions changes the response. That's not complicated, it's just slow. Whether this video describes something you've lived through, something someone you love is living through right now, or simply something you wanted to understand, there's one thing I want to leave you with. The brain that formed this bond did not betray you. It protected you. It took the impossible situation it found itself in and built the best possible response available to it. that it needed to build that response at all, that it was placed in conditions where that was the best available move, is the thing that demands accountability, not the person who survived it. The conditions, the person or system that created those conditions. If you've ever felt ashamed of how you felt about someone who hurt you, please hear this clearly. Your brain did its job. It kept you alive in the only way it knew how. What happened to you was not your failure, it was your survival. Your mind is always working, even when the conditions it's working in aren't fair. Stay aware. If this video describes something familiar, the trauma bonding video covers the specific neurological mechanism of why painful relationships become addictive, and it goes deeper on the cycle of tension and relief that sits at the heart of both topics. It's linked on screen now. And if you want to understand how these same dynamics are deliberately engineered in cults and high control groups, the Cult Mind playlist starts right after. Stay aware.